So the process of curricularizing language then involves a series of interacting mechanisms, the elements of which can function as part of a complex system that can be thought of as a set of concentric circles. So here's my concentric circles. And as you see, I put at the heart of this the core program elements. This is what we do in our classrooms. But what we do in our classrooms are influenced by policies, conducts, and traditions, and by ideological and theoretical mechanisms. So here's another version of the same diagram, and I'm going to talk about core program elements now. So let me turn to this particular slide. Every program that purports to teach language has program goals and outcomes. We've decided what we think that that particular program will accomplish. And this is not going to show right, so I'm going to put it all together. So to have program goals, we have to have instructional approaches, and instructional approaches are supported by instructional materials. But of course, we always have to consider the learner categorizations, the instructor competencies, and of course the assessments. All of those things work together as program goals. So let me talk a bit, and it's interesting, I'm nodding at Magali because I had made all of these changes in my PowerPoint of all the things that don't work. So when you see them, know that we will share with you something that really looks much better than this presentation. I'm having computer goblins, just so you know. So to continue then, what we know is that there are two main approaches to language teaching. There's an analytic approach that always focuses on grammar. And when you have an analytic approach to the teaching of language, you study rules and language items, and you practice, and you give a lot of attention to accuracy and error correction, and less attention to social interaction. An alternative way to approach language teaching is experiential. And experiential approaches to teaching focus on themes or functions. They engage in purposeful activities. They focus on language use. And the priority is on meaning transfer and fluency, and social interaction is important. So almost every language teaching program, and by the way, if you're ever interested in this, there's a wonderful book by Kelly called 25 Centuries of Language Teaching. We have been teaching language for 25 centuries, beginning with Greek and Latin. And many of the things that we do today in language classrooms are things that were done when people were teaching Greek and Latin, just so you know. But they vary between the deeply analytical and the experiential language program. So choosing instructional materials for whatever we decide is the goal of our language program is always fundamental. In theory, materials must be aligned with program goals. And in many programs, the language textbook is the whole curriculum. Right? So that if you happen to be in an ESL program, for example, you'll be handed an ESL book, and that becomes the curriculum. But the choice of materials in schools is often very much more complicated. For example, in our current educational context, there's vendors galore. Right? I always tell the people that I meet in schools, I say, beware of vendors. And they promise a lot of things. They promise so-called evidence-based solutions for example, addressing vocabulary gaps, or teaching sentence stems, or leveling English language development classes, or supporting the acquisition of cash English in those places, for example, where it's considered that the students do not speak standard English. They may sell you a wonderful program so that you can teach standard English, calling it cash English. And maybe some others want to deal with reading, and they'll sell you programs on developing phonological awareness, or building reading fluency, or possibly promoting lexile growth. Right? So vendors sell a lot of materials that we hope are aligned with programs. Unfortunately, in some of my work in schools, what I find is, if we're looking at the trajectories of English language learners, right now we're doing a study of LTELs in a program in a school district where, if you look at 8th graders and you look at their trajectories, they had 5 or 6 different kinds of programs across their lifetimes, none of them coherent with the next one, all because of the program vendors. So, closing the achievement gap is very important for all of us. We know that because of the accountability assessment, this becomes very important. So language instruction, in addition to it requiring the materials, the goals, it also requires the categorization of learners. So we typically talk about beginners, and this is just the standard language class. We always are talking about, are they beginners? Are they intermediate learners? Are they advanced beginners? But if we're in bilingual education, we might say, are they dual language learners? We want to know. Do they come from homes where two languages are already spoken? And many of the kids that come into bilingual education programs already come with two languages from the home. They're acquiring two languages in everyday use. But others are monolingual learners. They're newcomers. They're newly arrived, right? Or if you have two-way bilingual education programs, those monolingual learners may be white students who are monolingual speakers of English. Or we might actually have heritage language learners. And these are the students that maybe someone in their family used to speak Spanish, right? Maybe they have grandparents, right? But maybe their parents no longer speak a whole lot of Spanish and they want their children to recover that Spanish, so they're sending them to your bilingual education program. So often we refer to them as heritage language learners, and they have an advantage over our white students that are monolingual English speaking, because at least there's someone somewhere that could speak to them in that language that they use at school, right? So they're different. But we could also have this new category of long-term English language learners. And I can say something about that in our question and answer if you're interested. But these construction of language learner categories, they may appear to be neutral and common sense, but they deeply affect the academic lives of students because we sort them and categorize them in ways that seriously impact their lives. So, classroom assessments, at their best, okay, if we have a classroom assessment of our own program, they include formative procedures that provide us information about what we're going to teach, and assessments of language development for engaging with specific content. For example, if I happen to be the ESL specialist in a school, this is what I want. I want assessments of language development for engaging with specific content. I want to know what I'm going to help the teachers, okay, that are part of this program teach, and we want them to make certain that what they develop is the language that they need for engaging with specific content. So, as I said, the core program elements are impacted by other things that are one level above, okay, that are part of the educational policies, the political situational context, the language standards, and the accountability assessments. The accountability assessments are very different than the classroom assessments, or they should be, right? Because they're doing very different things. So, these policies, educational policies, drive the content and language standards, and it depends upon the climate, right? What happened to those language standards? So we know we went from No Child Left Behind to ESSA, and it depended on the context and the politics as we're going along, and the assessments responded also to what was going on in the politics in the world, right? So we're dependent. What we do in the classroom is definitely going to be impacted by these kinds of things. Language policies are enacted at multiple levels: the state, the school district, the institution that we're in, and they're established expected competencies and proficiencies, and we implement various types of standards, whether they're content standards or English language proficiency standards. And so language policies are really important for us because they also mandate accountability assessments. And if you think about accountability assessments, they're designed to measure learning outcomes as mandated by relevant language policies. Whatever the language policy decides that good language is, they're going to build the assessment instrument to be able to do that. And how language is conceptualized in these assessments has an enormous impact on what happens in classrooms. So you can look at the assessment and you could immediately see the backwash. What that assessment purports to measure, however it measures it, that's what we're going to see happening in our classrooms. But what also impacts what we do in our classrooms are these, what I call the theoretical and ideological mechanisms. And these include conceptualizations of language, theories of second language acquisition, theories of bilingualism, and ideologies of race, language, class, etc. So let me say a little bit about those. Theoretical and ideological mechanisms include these four things: conceptualizations of language, theories of second language acquisition, theories of bilingualism, and these ideologies. So let me begin with conceptualizations of language. Right? Teaching language requires that we agree on what it is that has to be learned or taught, given that definition of language. And it depends on what needs to be taught given different learner characteristics and goals. In theory, those kids that are dual language learners would get a different kind of a program than those that came in as monolingual speakers of the language in our bilingual education programs, right? And we have to agree what it is that we want to teach them to begin with. And what we do, it depends on how we think those things are learned, right? And it also depends on what we know about how teachable they are. Remember, most of our 25 centuries of language teaching have involved trying to teach language to adults. And some of those traditional ways of teaching language, what they did was focus on structure and form exclusively. What we don't know a whole lot is whether teaching structure and form to young children actually works. But we extrapolated from our 25 centuries of language teaching, and what we may know that some things are teachable to adolescents and adults, but they may not be teachable to 7-year-olds or to 9-year-olds. And yet we've done a lot of things in our language teaching process that involves extrapolating from what we've done about the teaching of adults. And I'm trying to argue that it may be problematic. So let's stop for a moment and say, what is language anyway? So is it structure and form? Definitely, language has structure and form. Is it a semiotic system? Well, it's that too. It's a meaning system. Of course it's that. How about a social practice? Well, of course, language is a social practice. Is it a set of rules? Well, yes, we do know that in fact there's a set of rules there that we can analyze it, okay, beautifully and say, oh, I see that this agrees with that. That's how it works. In Spanish we can't say that. In English we can't say the other thing. There's a set of rules. And maybe language is all of the above. But my point is, we have to start out with trying to conceptualize what in this program is how we think that we're seeing language.